There is a secret in this story that most people won't see coming, and when it finally comes out, everything changes. Margaret Boone had nothing. No home, no bank account, no family that claimed her. She slept under a bridge in Savannah, Georgia, with a wool blanket that smelled like river water and a shopping cart that held every object she owned on this earth. 2 dresses, a Bible, a thermos, a plastic bag of toiletries, and a framed photograph she kept wrapped in a towel at the bottom of the cart so rain couldn't reach it. She had been homeless for 6 years, but when she walked into the lobby of the Kensington Grand Hotel on a Wednesday afternoon in November and sat down in a velvet chair in front of the fireplace as if she belonged there, dirty coat, cracked shoes, shopping cart parked outside the revolving door, the owner of that hotel, a man named Lawrence Prescott III, made a decision that would unravel his entire life. He decided to test her. He pretended to call the police while his staff watched. But what he found out about this woman, and what she already knew about him, would bring a billionaire to his knees in front of his own employees, his own family, and his own reflection. Hey there, welcome back. Before this story begins, do us a favor. Like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. Drop your country in the comments below. Are you watching from Canada, Johannesburg, maybe Jamaica or Houston? We'd love to know. Now pay attention to what happens next, because this is one of those stories where the beginning and the ending are the same room, but the people standing in it are completely different. Margaret Boone was 67 years old. She had skin the color of dark honey, deep lines around her eyes that fanned out like the pages of a book that had been opened too many times, and hands that were rough but precise. The hands of a woman who had once done delicate work. She wore her gray hair in 2 braids that she pinned up under a knit cap, brown with a hole near the left ear that she kept meaning to patch, and never did. She had a slight limp in her right leg from a fall 3 years earlier. She'd slipped on a wet sidewalk near Forsyth Park and cracked something in her kneecap that she never got treated because emergency rooms ask for insurance cards before they ask for pain levels, and Margaret didn't have a card. She walked with a gentle lean to the left, compensating, and over time the lean had become part of her posture, part of her silhouette, so that people who saw Margaret Boone from a distance could identify her by the way she moved, slightly tilted like a tree growing around a wound. She had not always been this, and that is the thing about homelessness that people who have never experienced it fail to understand. It is not a permanent identity. It is a chapter. Some chapters last longer than others. Some chapters consume the entire book. But there was a time before, and in that time, Margaret Boone was someone else entirely. Before Savannah, before the bridge, before the shopping cart, Margaret Boone was Margaret Dubois, and she ran a 22-room bed and breakfast on Tybee Island called the Marigold House. She had built it with her husband, Charles Dubois, a soft-spoken carpenter from Beaufort, South Carolina, who could build a bookshelf so precise you could balance a marble on any surface and it wouldn't roll. They bought the property in 1989, a rundown Victorian with a sagging porch and termite damage, and 17 layers of wallpaper that Margaret stripped by hand over 2 summers. Charles fixed the bones. Margaret did the skin, the paint, the curtains, the flower beds, the hand-lettered sign that said, "The Marigold House," in gold letters on a blue background, because Margaret said marigolds were the only flower that looked good in every kind of light. The house had a smell that guests remembered for years. Fresh linen, beeswax polish, and whatever Margaret was baking that morning, which was usually cinnamon rolls, because Charles loved cinnamon rolls the way some men love steak, completely and without reservation. They ran the Marigold House for 19 years. 19 years of clean sheets and beeswax and cinnamon and guests who came back because Margaret remembered their names, and Charles fixed anything that broke before they noticed it was broken. They had no children. They tried, it didn't happen, and they held each other through the grief of that without letting it define them, which is a kind of strength that most people never have to test. The business was their child. Every room was named after a flower. Every guest was a member of a family they had built out of hospitality and attention and the conviction that making a stranger feel at home was not a service, but a vocation. Charles died in 2008. Heart attack. He was 61. He was in the workshop behind the house, building a new headboard for the dahlia room, and he fell sideways into a pile of cedar shavings, and by the time Margaret found him, he was gone. The shavings were in his hair. She brushed them out before the paramedics arrived because she didn't want strangers to see him that way. That detail, the brushing of the shavings, tells you everything about Margaret Dubois. She cared for people. She cared for them when they were alive, and she cared for them when they were dead. And she cared for them in ways that no one asked for, and no one noticed, and no one paid her for. She just did it, the way marigolds just grow. But what happened next changed everything. After Charles died, Margaret tried to run the marigold house alone. She couldn't. Not because the work was too hard. Margaret was no stranger to hard work. But because the financing was structured around two incomes, and one of those incomes had stopped. Charles's life insurance, which they had always assumed would cover emergencies, turned out to be a $25,000 term policy that had been slowly depleted by premium increases neither of them had noticed. The mortgage on the property was $2,300 a month. Revenue dropped when Margaret couldn't maintain the level of service guests expected. She couldn't be at the front desk and in the kitchen and fixing the plumbing and mowing the lawn all at the same time. Reviews slipped. Bookings declined. The bank that held the mortgage began sending letters, first reminders, then warnings, then the word foreclosure in bold type at the top of a page that Margaret read at the kitchen table where she and Charles used to eat cinnamon rolls on Sunday mornings. She lost the Marigold house in 2011. The bank sold it at auction for $310,000 to a developer from Atlanta who turned it into luxury condominiums and tore out the flower beds and replaced the hand-lettered sign with a metal one that said, Tybee Landing. Margaret stood across the street and watched the sign come down, and she held the framed photograph, the only thing she took from the house, which showed Charles and Margaret on the porch on opening day in 1989, Charles with cedar shavings in his shirt and Margaret holding a basket of marigolds. She wrapped the photograph in a towel and placed it in a bag, and she has carried it every day since. The years between 2011 and 2019 are the years Margaret doesn't talk about. They are the years of shelters and park benches and the bridge near River Street where the sound of the water helped her sleep because it sounded like the ocean on Tybee Island if she closed her eyes and didn't think too hard. She applied for housing assistance. The wait list was 14 months. She applied for disability. Denied. Her knee injury was classified as non-work related because she hadn't been employed at the time of the fall. She applied for jobs. She was 61, then 62, then 65. And every application landed in the specific silence that greets older women who have no recent employment history, no references, no address to put on the form. She existed in the gap between systems, too old to start over, too young for certain benefits, too proud to beg, and too tired to fight the bureaucracy that kept telling her she didn't qualify for help she desperately needed. But Margaret had no idea what was coming. Now let me tell you about Lawrence Prescott III, because this story has two hearts, and his is the one that needs the most repair. Lawrence Prescott III was 54 years old, and he had spent his entire adult life making sure that number, the third, was the first thing anyone knew about him. He was the third generation of Prescotts to own the Kensington Grand Hotel, a 180-room luxury property on Bull Street in the heart of Savannah's historic district. His grandfather, Lawrence I, had built it in 1952. His father, Lawrence II, had expanded it in the 1970s. Lawrence III had inherited it in 2001 when his father retired to a house on Hilton Head and told his son, "Don't lose it." Lawrence took that instruction literally and personally, and he ran the Kensington Grand with the rigidity of a man who believes that wealth is a wall, and that the purpose of a wall is to keep people out. He wore tailored suits, charcoal, navy, occasionally a muted plaid, and Italian shoes that clicked on the marble lobby floor the way a metronome clicks, announcing his presence before he entered any room. He had thin lips that he pressed together when he was angry, which was often, and he had a habit of adjusting his cufflinks when he spoke to employees, a small, unconscious gesture that communicated without words that his accessories were worth more of his attention than their conversation. He was not physically imposing, but he occupied space the way certain men occupy space. Not by filling it, but by claiming it, by making everyone around him feel like guests in a room he owned, which, in the case of the Kensington Grand, he literally did. Lawrence had a secret, and that is the thing about this story that nobody sees coming. Lawrence Prescott III was not Lawrence Prescott III. He was Lawrence Prescott, yes, but the third was a fiction. His grandfather had not built the Kensington Grand. His grandfather had been the maintenance man. Lawrence III, the real Lawrence III, was a janitor named Larry Prescott who mopped the lobby of a hotel called the Chatham Arms in 1952, and who, when the Chatham Arms went bankrupt in 1958, used his savings and a loan from a black-owned credit union to buy the property at auction for $14,000. He renovated it himself. He renamed it the Kensington Grand because he thought the name sounded like money. And he was right. Lawrence II expanded it, that part was true, but he also did something else. He rewrote the family history. He told his son, Lawrence III, that the Prescotts had always been wealthy, that the hotel had been built, not bought at a bankruptcy auction by a janitor, that the family's success was inherited, not earned with a mop and a bucket and a loan from a credit union that the banks wouldn't match. Lawrence III believed the story. He grew up believing it. He built his entire identity around it. The suits, the cufflinks, the three, the marble lobby, the Italian shoes that clicked. He was a man standing on a foundation he didn't know was made of the same material he looked down on. And he'd spent 30 years making sure that no one, especially not someone who reminded him of what the Prescotts actually were, ever got close enough to the foundation to see the cracks. And that is the thing about pride. Once it breaks, the pieces never fit the same way again. On November 14, 2019, Margaret Boone pushed her shopping cart up to the front entrance of the Kensington Grand Hotel. She didn't go inside right away. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at the building, the brown brick, the gold lettering, the awning with the burgundy trim. She looked at it the way a person looks at a place they recognize but can't quite place, the way a melody sounds familiar before you remember the words. Then she straightened her coat, left the cart outside, and walked through the revolving door. The lobby was warm. It smelled like furniture polish and fresh flowers, orchids, not marigolds, arranged in a crystal vase on a marble table in the center of the room. The fireplace was lit. The velvet chairs flanking it were empty. Margaret walked to the chair on the left, the one closer to the fire, and sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 6 years, she felt warm in a way that went past temperature and reached something deeper. The specific warmth of a beautiful room that someone had cared for, a room that reminded her of rooms she used to build. The front desk manager, a woman named Priya, saw Margaret immediately. Priya was 31, efficient, and trained to handle situations like this with discretion. She walked to Margaret and said politely, "Ma'am, can I help you? Are you a guest?" Margaret opened her eyes. "No, sweetheart, I'm just sitting." Priya hesitated. She looked at Margaret's coat, stained, frayed at the cuffs. She looked at Margaret's shoes, cracked leather, one sole separating from the toe. She looked at Margaret's hands, clean, surprisingly clean, the nails short and neat, the hands of a woman who still cared for herself even when the world had stopped caring for her. Priya said, "I'll need to check with management." Priya called Lawrence. Lawrence came down from his office on the 3rd floor. He walked into the lobby in his charcoal suit with his shoes clicking on the marble, and he saw Margaret Boone sitting in his velvet chair by his fireplace in his hotel, and his thin lips pressed together so tightly they disappeared. "Ma'am," he said, standing over her, "this is a private establishment. You can't sit here." Margaret looked up at him. She didn't stand. She didn't flinch. She looked at him with the calm, level gaze of a woman who had once run a 22-room bed and breakfast and had looked at 10,000 guests in her lifetime and could tell within 3 seconds whether a person's authority came from strength or from fear. Lawrence's came from fear. She could see it. She could smell it under the cologne, the particular metallic scent of a man who is terrified that someone will discover he doesn't belong in his own lobby. "I'm not bothering anyone," Margaret said. "I just want to sit by the fire." "This hotel is for guests," Lawrence said. "Then I'd like a glass of water. That makes me a guest." Lawrence's jaw tightened. He turned to Priya. "Call security." He turned back to Margaret. "If you're not out of that chair in 2 minutes, I'm calling the police." Now, here is where the story splits into 2 rivers that run side by side before they crash into each other. Margaret didn't leave. She sat in that chair, and she looked at Lawrence and she said, "Young man, I know who built this hotel." Lawrence froze. His hand, which had been reaching for his phone, stopped. "I beg your pardon?" he said. "I said I know who built this hotel. And you do too. You just don't say it out loud." The lobby went quiet. Priya was standing 4 feet away with a phone in her hand. The bellhop, a young man named Devon, was frozen near the elevators. 2 guests, a couple checking in at the front desk, turned to look. Margaret didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Quiet truth is louder than any shout. Lawrence's face shifted. Not a lot, but enough. Something behind his eyes moved. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. But he said it too quickly. And he took a half step backward, which was the smallest retreat in the world and the largest tell. "Sit down," Margaret said. She gestured to the empty chair across from her. The other velvet chair, the one on the right side of the fireplace. "Sit down and let me tell you a story." But what Margaret didn't know yet was that this moment would set off a chain of events nobody could stop. Lawrence didn't sit. Not yet. He stood with his arms crossed and his cufflinks catching the firelight, and his entire body arranged in the posture of a man who is in control, which is always the posture of a man who is losing it. Margaret waited. She had spent 6 years sleeping under a bridge. She had nothing but time. Then a voice came from the staircase. "Lawrence, what's going on?" It was his mother. Constance Prescott, 78 years old, white hair, pearl earrings, a woman who had been married to Lawrence II for 41 years, and who had lived inside the family's rewritten history for so long that the truth was buried under layers of silk and silver and Savannah society. Constance descended the stairs. She kept a suite on the 4th floor and came down every afternoon at 3 for tea in the lobby. And she saw Margaret, and she stopped. She stopped the way a body stops when the brain recognizes something before the eyes do. Constance's hand gripped the banister. Her face went pale. Not the pallor of illness, the pallor of recognition. She stared at Margaret for 5 full seconds. Then she said in a voice that was thin and careful and terrified, "Maggie?" Margaret smiled. The real smile, the one that lived under the cracked shoes and the wool blanket and the 6 years under the bridge. "Hello, Connie." Lawrence looked at his mother. He looked at Margaret. He said, "You know her?" Constance's eyes were wet. She descended the remaining stairs slowly, one hand on the banister, the other pressed against her chest. She walked to Margaret's chair. She stood in front of this homeless woman in the velvet chair by the fireplace, and she said, "This is Margaret Dubois. She was my roommate at SCAD. We shared an apartment on Drayton Street in 1963. Now the story you thought you knew is a different story entirely. Margaret and Constance had been best friends at the Savannah College of Art and Design, back when it was smaller, cheaper, and willing to enroll 2 girls from modest families who wanted to study interior design. Margaret was studying hospitality. Constance was studying textiles. They lived together for 2 years. They ate dinner together every night. They talked about the businesses they would build. Margaret wanted a bed and breakfast. Constance wanted to open a fabric shop. They were 20 years old, and the future was something they designed together at a kitchen table, sketching floor plans on napkins. In 1965, Constance met Larry Prescott Jr., Lawrence II. He was handsome and wealthy, and his family owned a hotel, or so he said. Constance was swept in. She dropped out of SCAD. She married Larry in 1966. She moved into the Prescott world, the suits, the society dinners, the revised family history, and she left Margaret behind. Not cruelly, not intentionally, but with the particular thoroughness that wealth brings to friendships, the way money rearranges a person's social landscape until the old landmarks are covered over and the new ones feel like they were always there. They lost touch. Margaret married Charles, built the Marigold house, lost Charles, lost the house, fell through every net the world provides.
And Constance, who had sketched floor plans on napkins, who had wanted a fabric shop, who had been Connie from Drayton Street, became Mrs. Lawrence Prescott II, and then the mother of Lawrence Prescott III, and then a woman who drank tea at 3 in the lobby of a hotel that her husband told her his father had built from scratch, when in fact his father had bought it with a janitor's savings and a credit union loan. Constance knew the truth. She had found out in 1988 when Lawrence II, drunk on anniversary champagne, had let it slip. The mop, the auction, the $14,000. She had never told their son. She had carried the secret for 31 years because Lawrence II had said, "If this gets out, we lose everything." And Constance had believed him. Because when you build your life on a stage, the fear of the curtain falling is worse than any truth behind it. And now Margaret was sitting in the lobby, and the curtain was falling. Lawrence looked at his mother. "How do you know this woman?" Constance sat down in the chair across from Margaret, the chair Lawrence had refused. She took Margaret's hands. She held them the way you hold something you thought you'd lost forever. She said, "Lawrence, sit down. There are things you need to hear." Lawrence sat. Not in a chair, on the marble floor. He sat on the floor of his own lobby because there were no more chairs, and because his legs made the decision before his pride could overrule them. And Constance told him. She told him about Larry Prescott, the janitor, about the mop and the Chatham Arms and the bankruptcy auction and the $14,000. She told him that the 3/3 was a fiction, that the dynasty he had built his identity around was 2 generations old, not 3. And that it had started not in a boardroom, but on a lobby floor, with a mop, the same way Margaret's shopping cart sat on a sidewalk 30 feet from where they were sitting. Lawrence's face went through a demolition. The charcoal suit, the Italian shoes, the cufflinks, the pressed lips, all of it was scaffolding, and the scaffolding was coming down. He looked at his hands. He said, "Dad lied to me." Constance said, "Your father lied to everyone, including himself." Margaret watched this. She watched a man discover that the pedestal he had been standing on was built by someone he would have thrown out of his own lobby. She felt no satisfaction. She felt something closer to sorrow. The sorrow of a woman who understood that pride is a room with no windows, and that the person trapped inside it suffers even if they built the walls themselves. She leaned forward. She took Lawrence's hand, the hand with the cufflink, the hand that had never mopped a floor, the hand that had pointed at her and said, "Call security." And she said, "Your grandfather and I have something in common, Lawrence. We both cleaned floors. We both lost what we built. The only difference is that somebody helped him start over. A credit union gave him $14,000 and a chance. Nobody gave me that. But I'm not here for money. I'm here because I was cold, and I remembered this lobby had a fireplace." Lawrence looked at her hand holding his. He looked at his mother, crying silently in the velvet chair. He looked at the marble floor he was sitting on, the floor his grandfather had mopped, the floor Margaret had admired, the floor that connected every person in this room to a truth that none of them had been willing to say out loud. And Lawrence Prescott III, a man who had spent 30 years keeping people out, said the first honest sentence of his adult life. "I am the grandson of a janitor, and I have been treating people the way I was afraid people would treat me if they knew." Margaret squeezed his hand. "That's not a confession, sweetheart. That's a beginning. Now, there were things that needed to be fixed. There always are when the truth finally arrives. Truth doesn't clean up after itself. It just sits in the room and waits for someone to deal with the mess."
Lawrence stood up from the marble floor. He straightened his suit. The habit was too deep to break in one afternoon. And he did something that Priya, the front desk manager, would tell her children about for the rest of her life. He turned to Priya and Devon and the two guests at the front desk and every employee within earshot, and he said, "My grandfather was a janitor. He mopped the floor of the hotel that used to stand on this spot. He bought it at a bankruptcy auction with his savings and a loan. My father told me we built this hotel from nothing. That's true. But the nothing was a mop and a bucket, not a trust fund. I have spent my career pretending to be something I'm not, and I have treated people who work with their hands as if their hands were worth less than mine." He looked at Margaret. "This woman ran a bed and breakfast that was better than this hotel.
I know because my mother just told me she stayed there once, in 2004, and said it was the most beautiful place she'd ever slept.
And now she's homeless. And I almost called the police on her for sitting in a chair. The lobby was so quiet you could hear the fire breathing." Lawrence turned to Margaret. He said, "I'd like to offer you a room. Not charity, employment. This hotel doesn't have a soul. It has marble and velvet and orchids, and it has no soul. You built a place that people came back to because it felt like home. I need that. I'm asking you, will you help me?" Margaret looked at him for a long time. She looked at his suit and his shoes and his cufflinks, and she saw, underneath all of it, the ghost of a janitor's grandson who had been wearing a costume for 30 years and had just taken it off in public. She said, "I'll help you, but I have one condition." "Name it." "The orchids go. We're planting marigolds." Lawrence almost laughed.
Not quite. His mouth wasn't used to it yet. But the muscles tried, and trying was enough for now. Margaret moved into the Kensington Grand that evening, not as a guest, as the Director of Guest Experience, a title Lawrence invented on the spot because no existing title captured what Margaret was. She was given a room on the second floor, Room 7, the Gardenia Room, with a fireplace and a window that overlooked Bull Street, and a bed so soft that Margaret sat on the edge of it for 10 minutes before lying down, because she had forgotten what soft felt like and needed to remember slowly. She went to work the next morning. She started with the lobby. She replaced the orchids with marigolds, bright orange and gold, in simple clay pots, not crystal vases. She replaced the printed welcome cards with handwritten notes, a different note for each guest, written by Margaret in the same precise handwriting that had once labeled the rooms of the Marigold House. She trained the housekeeping staff, not in technique, but in philosophy. "A clean room is a service," she told them. "A room that feels like someone cared about you before you arrived. That's a gift. That's what we're making. Gifts." She baked cinnamon rolls on Sunday mornings. The smell filled the lobby. Guests followed it like a signal. They sat by the fireplace and ate cinnamon rolls that tasted like someone's grandmother had made them. Because someone's grandmother had. Charles's recipe, unchanged, written on an index card that Margaret had carried in her Bible for 11 years. The ink smudged by river water, but still legible, still holding. Occupancy at the Kensington Grand went from 67% to 89% in 6 months. Reviews on every travel platform mentioned the marigolds, the handwritten notes, the cinnamon rolls, and a woman named Margaret who remembered every guest's name and asked about their children and their drive and whether they needed extra pillows, and who made them feel, for the first time in a hotel, like they were not customers, but company. Devon, the bellhop, 23, studying hospitality at Savannah State, became Margaret's apprentice. She taught him what she had learned at the Marigold House, not from a textbook, but from 19 years of watching what made people feel welcome. She said, "People don't remember thread count, Devon. They remember whether you looked them in the eye when they walked in. They remember whether you said their name. They remember the smell." Devon listened. He took notes in a notebook, spiral, just like Margaret's. Constance and Margaret had tea together every afternoon at 3. They sat in the velvet chairs by the fireplace, the same chairs where the whole thing had started, and they talked the way they had talked on Drayton Street in 1963, about fabric and floor plans and what makes a room feel alive. One afternoon, Constance said, I should have come looking for you, Maggie. When I heard about Charles, when I heard about the house, I should have come. Margaret said, You're here now. Constance said, Is that enough? Margaret took her hand. Connie, I slept under a bridge for 6 years. Believe me, showing up late is better than not showing up at all. Lawrence changed. Not overnight. People who have worn costumes for 30 years don't undress in a day. But he changed. He stopped wearing the Italian shoes in the hotel. He wore plain loafers, the kind that don't click. He stopped adjusting his cufflinks during conversations. He stopped calling the cleaning staff the girls. He learned their names. He learned that the head housekeeper, a Jamaican woman named Paulette, had 3 grandchildren and made rum cake at Christmas, and had been working at the Kensington Grand for 14 years without a single day's absence. He learned that the parking valet, a Nigerian man named Emeka, was completing a master's degree in civil engineering at Georgia Southern and working nights to pay tuition. He learned that his hotel was full of people who were doing exactly what his grandfather had done, working with their hands and their hours and their dignity to build something out of nothing. And he had been looking past all of them for 30 years, because his father had taught him that looking past them was what Prescott's did. One evening, after the lobby had quieted and the guests had gone to dinner, Lawrence found Margaret in the kitchen. She was baking cinnamon rolls for the next morning. The kitchen smelled like butter and cinnamon and warm dough, the smell that Charles had loved and that Margaret kept alive the way you keep a candle lit in a room where someone you love used to sit. Lawrence sat on a stool and watched her work. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You just did. Why did you come into my hotel that day? You could have gone to a shelter, a church, anywhere with a fire." Margaret didn't look up from the dough. She pressed it with the heel of her hand, firm, even, the way Vivian pressed bills flat on a kitchen table, the way women press things flat when they are trying to make something smooth out of something rough. She said, "Because I saw the building and I recognized it. Not the building itself, the feel of it. A building that someone built with care. I could see it in the brickwork, in the trim, in the way the front step was set at exactly the right height so your foot lands naturally. Whoever built this place loved it, and I wanted to sit in a room that somebody loved, because I hadn't been in one in a long time." She looked up. "I didn't know about your grandfather. I didn't know he was a janitor. I found that out the same moment you did. I just knew the building felt like a building that had been built by someone who understood work. And I was right. I just didn't know how right." Lawrence sat with that for a while. Then he said, "My father told me we were different from the people who clean our floors. He said that's what the 3WUD was for, to remind people that we were 3 generations of something." He paused. "But we're not 3 generations of wealth. We're 3 generations of work. And the first one, the one with the mop, did the hardest work of all." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at Lawrence, 54, sitting on a stool in a kitchen, without the suit jacket, without the cufflinks, without the armor he had been wearing since he was old enough to inherit it. And she said, "Your grandfather cleaned a floor and bought a building. I cleaned a floor and lost one. The difference between us isn't talent or character or worth. It's that somebody gave him a loan and nobody gave me one. That's it. That's the whole difference. And if you understand that, if you really understand that, then you'll stop looking at people like me and seeing a problem, and start seeing a person who ran out of chances, not out of ability." Lawrence closed his eyes. When he opened them, he said, "I owe you more than a room and a job title." Margaret shook her head. "You don't owe me anything. You owe the next person, the next woman who walks into your lobby in a dirty coat and cracked shoes. You owe her a chair by the fire and a glass of water, and the assumption that she is someone until proven otherwise. That's what your grandfather would have done, because he was her before he was you." Today, Margaret Boone is 71 years old. She lives at the Kensington Grand Hotel in room 7, the room she renamed the Marigold Room. There are marigolds on the windowsill. The framed photograph, Charles and Margaret on the porch, opening day, 1989,
sits on the nightstand beside a vase of fresh marigolds that the housekeeping staff replaces every Monday because Paulette decided it was the marigold room's signature, and signatures are non-negotiable. Margaret still bakes cinnamon rolls every Sunday. She still writes handwritten welcome notes for every guest. She still remembers every name. Lawrence removed the 3/3 from his business cards.
He commissioned a plaque for the lobby, brass, simple, mounted on the wall beside the fireplace, that reads, "This hotel was founded in 1958 by Larry Prescott, who purchased the building with his savings and a loan from the Savannah Mutual Credit Union. Before he was an owner, he was a janitor. This lobby exists because a man with a mop believed that clean floors were worth something." Beneath the plaque, in a small glass case, is a mop. Not the original, but one just like it, purchased from the same hardware store on Broughton Street that Larry Prescott would have used. It sits in the case the way a medal sits in a case, not as a tool, but as evidence of origin. Devon graduated from Savannah State last spring. He is now the Kensington Grand's youngest ever assistant manager. He keeps a spiral notebook in his back pocket, Margaret's influence. And every Wednesday afternoon at 3, Margaret and Constance sit in the velvet chairs by the fireplace. Two women, 71 and 82, who shared an apartment on Drayton Street when they were 20 and who were separated by money and time and the specific cruelty of a world that makes it easy to lose touch with the people who knew you before you became whoever you became. They drink tea. They talk about fabric and floor plans and what makes a room feel alive. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, Margaret reaches into her cardigan pocket and pulls out a marigold seed and sets it on the arm of Constance's chair. She doesn't explain why. Constance doesn't ask. Some things between old friends don't need language. They just need a seed and a chair and the warmth of a fire in a room that both of them, in different ways, helped build. I hope this story stays with you for a while. Please like, share, and subscribe. Tell us in the comments what you would have done differently. We love reading your thoughts. Until next time.